Welcome everybody to Game Retail Ramblings, episode 21. I'm your host, Travis Severance, coming to you live from Millennium Game Studios in Rochester, New York, home of the largest game store in the country. Today, we're going to talk about Set 2, Shadows of the Galaxy for Star Wars Unlimited. Thank you everybody that commented and liked the last video. I had a great time talking about community building. Community building is super important to us. It is a way for us to stand out and provide customers with something that isn't just buying boxes off a shelf and selling them products. We're actually selling them experiences. So it's an entertainment model that's built into the brand, and it's a huge part of what we do here. And it's critical for the different types of games that we run, whether it's role-playing games, board games, CCGs, miniature games. All of them have their different times on our event calendar that people can play and interact with those games. And it certainly does a lot for us in terms of repeat customers, having people have a reason to come into the store other than just release events and things like that. And it's a major part of why, we went from 100 seats in the old store space to 300 seats in this space. It was done with intentionality, and thus far it's been really good for us. We're about a week and a half past 1 year in the new location. Our gross sales were up a little over 30% from last year in the similar time. So thus far the new space has been working out. I mean, obviously costs have increased. We've had we almost doubled our staff when we moved into the new space. Things like that have changed, but people have certainly shown up from the market, and the sales say that we've done the right thing in terms of making the decision to move into this new space. So we'll see what the next year has to offer. But we're going to talk about Star Wars Unlimited Set 2, and I talked about Star Wars Unlimited way back in episode 8. It was one of the most watched episodes that I have. If you haven't seen that, feel free to pop in there. I gave some opinions. It was after the game had hit, and I think it was at a point where supply started to get a little bit tight. The first week of the set launch for Set 1, everybody was able to still reorder. I could have ordered as much as I wanted at that point. It wasn't until the following week, which I think is when I ran that episode, where products started to get tight, and it might have been either just before or just after they had announced that they were going to limited quantities on boxes for retail accounts to, I think it was 3 a month initially, and then it was 1 a month. At that time, boxes were going on TCG Player for $140, so I bought every single one that was there for less than that or around that, and we had plenty of stock for the next couple of months anyways. We've run through that product at this point. Set 1 boxes at the time had peaked out at around $260. I think they've settled down around $208 now, which is higher than MSRP. It's not as healthy as I'd like it to be. I'd like to see those boxes come down a little bit, but I think that it says that there's a vibrant market out there, and some of that stuff has held. The other thing that I think it sort of speaks to as well is when you're comparing these two sets, and I'll get into that in the body of the episode. There's a lot of fundamental cards in Set 1 that are just strong because they're just basic cards that are fundamentally sound, that are going to continue to be relevant for the game moving forward. I'm interested to see what they decide to do, and if they decide to do a Set 1 reprint. I know it's something that they had talked about doing previously, and I'm not sure where they're sitting as far as that goes, whether they're still going to try to wedge that in. I'm not sure if it's necessarily needed or not. We'll see what the sales are on Set 2 and how many more people come to the market, whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea. Speaking of which, Bandai had just done a reprint on, I think it was Sets 1 through 4, so we got a chunk of those boxes. It certainly hammered the Set 1 boxes, which were several hundreds of dollars, and it's leveling them off around $250 or $220. So it had an impact there, and there's certainly some fundamental cards that are in the Set 1 for one piece. It didn't do a lot to Set 2 or Set 3 or Set 4. I don't know how much of it that made, but I would, if FFG's listening to this, I would tell them to be cautious about whatever that reprint is, because you can certainly overdo it, and they had been in that position before when I think they went back and they did a Destiny Set 1 reprint, and it didn't land as well as it probably could have. And I think the reprint that they did on the X-Wing 2.0 ship stuff was probably a little more than they needed to do on core. So I would be hesitant. They really did something that I haven't seen a company do maybe ever when it comes to a collectible product on this. So whether it was Fantasy Flight, whether it was Asmodee, whether it was a combination of the two, whether Southern Hobby had any sort of involvement in this or not. Typically what happens, and what I've gone through before, is a lot of times a big part of the success that I've had is being able to pick games that are winners. And a lot of times that's picking games that maybe the larger amount of retail community decides that either the game's not going to be good, they don't think there's a market for it, there's no way it can be successful, it's so different, whatever the case may be. A lot of the money that we've made here that has helped us grow a lot is based on picking things ahead of time and being ahead of the curve and investing more money. Some of that comes from just having capital where other people don't have capital. They don't have the ability to invest even if they wanted to, but some of that just comes from being able to take a look at something and break it down and decide this thing's going to be a winner. We did it with Destiny for sure. We did it with Dice Masters. We did it with Keyforge. We're certainly leaning into that with Altered, and we leaned in really heavy for this game too. A lot of the Bandai stuff, we do that as well. And what normally happens for us is we do really well with that first set, and we make a ton of money there because there's scarcity and there's a ton of people that want to, and we're selling it for over MSRP. The singles are fantastic and things like that. But typically what happens is after that, when it comes to set 2, the ride is over, right? Everybody's figured it out at that point. They know the game's hot. Everybody places their orders with distribution. They fire in a bunch of orders. They know it's going to be on Obtainium. It's pretty mindless selling at that point. And publishing sort of tries to make as much of it as they can without cratering the market, or they don't care about cratering the market. They just make as much as they want. And everybody sort of gets flattened out with regard to what they get for their allocation. And for better or for worse, what Fantasy Flight or Asmodee or some combination of the two decided to do on this thing is, for those of us that put our money where our mouth was and placed bigger orders on set 1, they rewarded us with our allocation for set 2. Instead of flattening out what we were going to get and putting us in line with everybody else, those of us that placed bigger bets got a bigger allocation. There's plenty of people out there that would look at that situation and look at it as sort of the haves and the have-nots. But the reality of it is the people that did decide that they were going to put their money up front and believed in the game and believed in the IP and believed in the publisher and believed in what it was were rewarded and paid out for that in set 2. Now, we'll see over the course of the sales for set 2 on whether or not that was a big boon or not, but at least I have a little bit more control over my destiny. Now, most of the time when it comes to games like this, everybody sort of is in the same crappy situation. The allocation gets leveled out in the interest of fairness, whatever that means in an open and free market. Everybody's allowed to bring themselves up to speed and things, and the reality of it is allocations are a touchy subject in the industry because most people don't do them effectively, and regardless of how you decide you're going to do allocations, somebody's going to complain about the way that it's done. And when I look at those things, there's people ordering less than a dozen boxes, there's people ordering several dozens, there's people like us that are ordering hundreds or pallets of them and things like that, and a 20% allocation on what we can hope to make on something like that is really significant to us, and everything scales down. They certainly run the risk by making this decision that some of the people that showed up late to the party are not going to get what they want, and they will end up cratering that community. What I've seen in the past, whether it was Destiny or whether it was Dice Masters or whatever, is the retailers that were the have-nots, the ones that didn't invest their time and effort into the property, end up tire kicking the game. They cratered in their own community, whether or not it would have been successful and it would have made them more money because they're not getting what they wanted to get with product for his allocation, and they've just decided that the game's no good. By doing this, I think Asmodee Fantasy Flight runs a little bit of risk of some attrition, but the reality of it is, whether it was done that way or it was done the traditional way or the way that's been done more often, sadly, there's going to be attrition for this game from retail no matter what. There's going to be people that are going to approach this game and they're going to look at it and they didn't get a lot of set 1 and they don't have the ability to build a community, or they're frustrated because they couldn't get more packs in. I'll be honest with you, everybody was frustrated that they couldn't get more packs in. Fantasy Flight was number 1 on the top of that list. They wanted to sell as many packs as they possibly could, and obviously they didn't produce those packs. I wanted to sell more packs, and I sold more packs than most people in the country. So everybody at every level was frustrated with the lack of supply. The reality of it is, it's a good game. The game's going to sell. It's a popular franchise. Set 2 is a very different animal from set 1. But if you're looking at this situation from the retail perspective and you're thinking to yourself, you didn't order and you didn't get everything that you wanted, well, you know what? I didn't get everything I wanted either. So there were allocations that definitely took place. What I would say is, if you're a retailer that's sitting there and you're frustrated because you got allocated down or you didn't get what you wanted, compare yourself and compare what you got versus what you ordered from day 1. Did you get more than what you got on day 1 before you believed in the game or before you knew the game was a hit? Most of the retailers that I see that are having conversations about it are frustrated because they didn't get hundreds of boxes, they got dozens of boxes. So they certainly got more than what they got day 1 for set 1, and more than what they believed in initially. So I think it's one of those things where you need to be honest with yourself as a retailer, and there's certainly a chance that I end up getting stuck with boxes that I don't end up needing depending on where this thing falls. Opening day set box prices are higher than what set 1 was for sure. I think set 1 a couple of days before the launch, you could get boxes on TCG Player for $92, $93, and that obviously that quickly escalated substantially, and I think our opening price for set 1 boxes were $99.99, somewhere in that realm, maybe $109.99. And then it slowly but surely crept up to be more in line with what the market was. Then everybody realized that we were on a rocket ship and we were going to go crazy, and people made different decisions on how they were going to deal with the fact that they didn't have as many packs as they wanted to, and how they were going to support organized play. And the big failings that was FFG. The same people that were saying, oh, FFG can't handle this thing, were the same people that 2 weeks before that were saying FFG can't make a good game. Well, you got to decide. Either they can't produce enough and you didn't order enough, or they can't make a good game. It can't be both of those things, right? And here we are sitting at the precipice of set 2, which is different and exciting, and something that's going to make a whole ton of money that I think is going to be solid for all of us. And it was interesting for me to see that Fantasy Flight and Asmodee made that decision, because, like I said, most of the time we only get rewarded on our ordering of the first one, and everybody else gets their stuff flattened out, and they go from there. So it's interesting to see how this will end up going. So for SWU, I haven't played SWU in a bit over a month. Personally, I'm a gaming butterfly, and what I mean by that is my time spent gaming inside of the community is limited, and typically what I do is I will either go in to try to help save a community that I think needs a little bit of effort attached to it, or I will go in and I will help fire the community, get the community going, and then hand it off to trusted people to be able to manage the community. And most of the time that's employees that are interested in the game. Sometimes it's volunteers that are interested in the game. Get the community up to where it's something stable, and then I can play and be involved in the community less so, because there's a million different communities that I want to be involved in that I can spend my time in, and I can only spend my time in certain ones at certain places. So in order to make sure that this Star Wars Unlimited thing was successful and I was going to put my money where my mouth was, I showed up to a bunch of the events early on. For the last month or so, I haven't been around and I haven't played the game. I noticed the meta has changed and things like that. But the reality of it is, for me, to be successful at what I do, I have to butterfly around. First of all, I don't have the attention span that can keep me interested in a game long term all that often. After 60 to 90 days, I tend to get bored with the game regardless of what the speed of it is, and I want to move on to something else because I've had enough. Towards the end of the meta, or the end of the time that I was playing Star Wars, I'd sort of played all the decks that I wanted to play. I'd figured the game out. I'd played it to the level of expertise that I was willing to work to play it to. Had some success, done pretty well locally with the events, and I felt good about it, and I was moving on to the next thing. There's two things that I end up training myself to do. I train myself to do orders like a CrossFit athlete, in that I need to have a little bit of knowledge based on a whole bunch of different areas. So I'm selling board games, card games, role-playing games, miniature games, and then everything else that's sort of on the periphery here as well. So I need to have some acumen when it comes to those sort of things, and some chops and some understanding. So I get myself to learning the fundamental core things about those product lines, and then if they end up being larger than what I can handle myself, I try to find somebody on staff to be able to manage the line, and I check in with them every couple of months to make sure things are running really well, make sure the sales are where they need to be, make sure our event calendar is where it needs to be, and so on and so forth. And the same thing is I evaluate games at the speed of a teenage kid on TikTok, right? I end up looking at a game, go through it really quick. There's so many games that are happening that I have to be able to flick that screen and be able to move on. And I'm not 100% on that. Nobody is in the world. People order bad games all the time, and or games aren't given the love that they need to, or maybe there's not enough focus on the local community, or maybe there's not enough focus on marketing. But I make bad picks all the time. I have a giant sales section with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of games that I'm trying to sell at 40% off because I made some bad choices. Now, it's not always me. Sometimes there's employees or staff members that also participate in that, but it was my responsibility to take on all the ordering that's done in the store. So at the end of the day, the buck stops with me. So I spend a lot of time doing that. I spend a lot of time evaluating games. I spend a lot of times figuring out the temperature of games beforehand. Gen Con is going to be a whole ton of meetings for me on the floor and off the floor and things like that. And it's going to be taking the temperature of what the community there is saying and figuring out what the next big thing is, what the next thing is that I care about. Last year it was Altered. This year I don't know what it is yet, but that's not atypical. It's funny when I say that because we're less than a month away from Gen Con, and I actually don't know what the big game is that I'm going to see. I haven't seen it yet. Now, when I come back, I'll probably do an after-action report on Gen Con and what I saw there, and I'll tell you half the things that I thought were great, because the other half I'm going to keep for myself. But if you're in the AMAs afterwards, I might tell you a little bit more. Back to SWU, FFG made the decision to do all those things they were going to do with how they're going to handle set 2. What I'm going to talk about in my top 7 is just concerns that I have for set 2. And maybe it's not just set 2, maybe it's some parts of the line in general, or operationally, just some general concerns that I have about things that I'm seeing, whether it's the set design, whether it's operational things, whether it's functional things that that FFG is doing that doesn't mean that I'm going to stop carrying the game, doesn't mean that I'm not going to stop supporting the game, doesn't mean that I'm going to do any sort of adjustment at all on any level for anything that I'm doing with regard to how I'm ordering the game, how I'm selling the game, the investment that I'm putting into the community. These are just things that I've noticed or I've identified that are, I'm not even going to say they're red flags. Maybe they're like off pink flags, right? They're just things that I've noticed so far that have happened for set 2, or things that they've made some decisions on that I'm hoping that there's some level of addressing it, or there's something that they have coming that's going to maybe take some of these concerns out of what I have. And I'm going to start with number 1 is the leaders for the set don't seem to stack up versus the second set. Every single deck has to have a leader. You've got 4 colors. You've got 2 sides of leaders. You've got villains and you've got heroes. We don't yet have a villain hero, or we don't yet have a mercenary leader. I'm sure that at some point we'll have something like that. So what happens is when you're making your deck, every single time you've chosen a color and a base conversation, you have to look at what your leader does and you have to stack it up against all the other leaders in that color. It's pretty easy for the most part right now, and some of it has to do with the limited card pool, and some of it has to do with the areas and the sub areas that they've decided to design into for this game. A tier ranking system for leaders is easier to do right now because you have a limited amount of leaders, and when you start looking at things like cunning leaders on the villain side of things, it's really difficult for you to look at any leader and compare them to Boba Fett, because Boba Fett just fundamentally does the things that you're trying to do in the game to win the game. He's eliminating characters and he's giving you resources for doing those things. As a huge Cad Bane fan, as much as I want to play Cad Bane, as much as I think the artwork is some of the best artwork in the entire set, which I'll talk about the artwork a little bit later as well, I have to look at Cad Bane and I have to go, all right, if I do this thing with Cad Bane and I compare, first of all, I'm giving my opponent control over where they decide that they're going to allocate the damage. Maybe there's damage to allocate, maybe there isn't damage to allocate, but I'm trying to compare it to somebody else who I'm killing a character and I'm getting resources for that, which I want to do every single turn.
Boba Fett is a cold-blooded killer.
It just, they don't stack up. And if you start looking at the stats and so on and so forth, and eventually it just becomes a math equation of, you know, this is what resources cost and this is the value you get for those and the power and the defense, and you start stacking those up and it just becomes pretty clear, unless a leader has a subtype or a super type. And what I mean by that when I talk about subtypes or super types is I'm talking about things that care about underworld, or things that care about Wookiees, or things that care about rebels, or things that care about Imperials. You know, all of those leaders will get better that care about super types as more cards get into the card pool. But the leaders that deal with the fundamentals of the game, like resources, are always going to be relevant. It doesn't matter, because you're always going to use resources. You're always going to try to eliminate characters on the board, because that's how you win the game. So when you start stacking the different leaders up against each other, the leaders for this set certainly look like they're significantly weaker than the ones from the first set. And if you were to compare them side to side, I don't think that's incorrect factually. Now, as the game progresses and more things become unveiled with the meta, maybe we'll see a shift in that. I haven't, again, played with all these cards. Maybe a month or so from now, we'll come back and I'll have to eat crow, because there's a fantastic amount of this new leader pool that are just amazing, and they knock all the leaders from set 1 out. But looking at it right now, I think there's maybe 4. I guess if I count Honda, maybe there's 5 leaders that I think are interesting for this set in a competitive sense. And I realize it's a casual game and we're going to play casually and so on and so forth. But when you look at quality of cards, I'll play the game casually too, but I don't want to show up with a non-competitive deck either, or a deck that I'm just having fun with. Number 2 is no new locations. Yes, I know there's generic locations that are in there. It's an interesting choice to me that they didn't put any 25 health locations in here. Maybe it's for the better. I think if we take a look at evaluating the 25 health locations that they came up with, it's very clear to me that ECL was the winner in that one, as ECL's in most competitive decks in some way. And then I think after that it was Tarkin Town for sure, and then the blue one got a little bit of play, but not a lot, and I don't think I ever saw the yellow. It's clear that there either wasn't enough focus from design, or there wasn't enough attention to design in terms of balancing those things out, and what's challenging for that is your base is fundamental. You can't show up to the game without a base, just the same as you can't show up to the game without a leader. Like, those 2 things are very crucial to what's happening inside of the game. I think another thing that would be interesting is looking at a constructed environment without ECL in it. I think it would open up a ton of different decks and different ideas and different designs if ECL wasn't around. So whether or not they decide to ban or restrict it or something like that would be interesting to see. I mean, they essentially created a character in this set with ECL built into it. So 2 ECLs in a game is I'm interested to see what that looks like. ECL by itself can be a real blowout, as we've seen throughout the course of the game in its limited time. So no new locations. I don't know how I feel about that in terms of it's less exciting when you open the packs and you don't have new locations in there to mess around with outside of the 30-point locations. Like, don't get me wrong, I definitely am excited about Jabba's Palace, but boy, I hope they come out with a different version of Jabba's Palace, because Jabba's Palace was pretty cool as a location in the game. I mean, you start Jedi there, and there's all the stuff that are going on, and we got to see some of that in Book of Boba Fett as well. So it would be cool if Jabba's Palace had an effect built onto it. It's pretty critical in the third movie there. Number 3 is lots of new mechanics and keywords. I guess it's not a ton, but if I look at the mechanics and if I look at the keywords for this set, bounty and smuggle, I think thematically they line up with what they do, and I think they're easy to understand from that standpoint. But for game mechanic wise, now you're asking players to take a look down at what their resources are, make a determination on whether or not the resource is going to go down there, whether paying for that cost makes it worth it for them to pull it out of the resource, to lose the resource, to do the thing. I think it's a lot of lifting for somebody to do if this is their first card game. And maybe the idea is most of the players that are playing in Star Wars in general are coming from other card games, and you're not building CCG players out of it. It's certainly not something that I would have saw from Lorcana as an example, so maybe it's not that bad. But I think when you're trying to debate, or you're trying to figure out whether bounty is worth it or not, for a new player, I think that's a hard assessment to sort of try to make. And you're asking them to calculate resources based on loss or gain, and I would have liked to have seen a second set where we sort of fleshed out the fundamentals a little bit more, as opposed to going into it with, we're going to build this set in a thematic way with these two sort of subtypes built into it that are relevant. I like the fact that they use bounty and smuggle, because they certainly both, they speak to the two sides of the coin that you're talking about with Shadows of the Galaxy. So from a theme perspective, I think they did a really good job coming up with keywords that work for the game, that are based around the two things that you're talking about, which is smuggling and bounty hunters. So from a flavor standpoint, I think they nailed the mechanics. I think that it's putting it on for set 2 and having people have to manage that and deal with that from a new player perspective is a little bit harder to do. So we'll see. Number 4, and I sort of spoke about this early on, I feel like the power level of this set feels a little bit lighter. And whether that's because we're dealing with bounty and smuggle, and they may or may not be strong abilities based on how they're implemented, maybe I'll change my opinion on that. I don't know. A lot of times if I'm looking at the strength of the set, the first thing I look at as sort of an indicator of the market is I look at the single costs, and the costs for singles for this set are pretty reasonable. There's, DJ's worth a couple of bucks and Snoke's worth a couple of bucks, but we do not have anything near what we have towards Vader. Now, maybe that'll change. Maybe as supply comes down, it'll be a situation where they go up the way that we saw that happen with the singles. Day one, I think you could get green Vaders for $12 on TCG Player, and those obviously shot up to quite a bit. So maybe we'll see the same thing from this, but it feels like in general the power level of this set is a little bit lighter, and whether that's because of the subtypes that are in the set, or whether it's because of the way that the new mechanics are, it doesn't feel like it's as strong as set 1 for sure. Set 5, and this is sort of, I guess it's personal feel, the store showdown cards feel pretty mid to me. Comparing the Worm Lady and the upgrade to Takedown, which is a card that'll probably be played for the entire existence of the game until they power creep it up to something else, and a character that's not really played, but certainly more loved than a Worm Lady that spends about 15 minutes in the front of the solo movie, Mace Windu. Just not what I thought we were going to see for Showdown. What I would have liked to see, they've leaned on flavor really well with this set. I would have liked to see 2 things that were sort of based on what the flavor was. I would have liked to seen a card that had bounty, and I would have liked to seen a card that had smuggle built into it, and something like that with some alternate art. So you were like really highlighting those things, and if it would have been more, if it would have been Maul as one of the cards or something like that instead, I think it would have been more interesting. So hopefully they take a look at what those Showdown cards are and sort of try to make them expressive in the theme of what the set is. I'm not sure why those cards were picked. They certainly don't seem as relevant as the cards before in terms of, Mace isn't played a whole ton, although we did see some of him in Han. The Worm Lady was great and sealed. We'll see what else happens with her. So time will tell on whether or not they end up being something that are solid or not. Speaking of which, we just saw they announced the convention packs. Those things look awesome. The framework, the treatment, all that stuff, the 6 cards in a pack for $100, and everybody's going to have their opinions about that kind of stuff. I will say that as somebody that goes to a lot of conventions, rewarding people that go to conventions with the opportunity to buy some exclusive products is not something that I'm going to kick you about. I think you should certainly do that. Sell those things for $100. I think they're more than reasonable in terms of the price based on what those cards are worth. We get a little bit of a preview for the cards in the next set, which is super cool. It helps them pay for their staff, and it helps them pay for the cost of going to the conventions and setting that thing up. It's a cool thing to be able to go and purchase those as a convention goer. I'm sure they're going to go for a whole ton of money. Based on what I saw, though, I like them. You continue that along. You don't need my blessing to be able to do that, but in general, I think that's a good move on their part, and I would have done the same thing. So hats off on that. I think they look great. Number 6 is core rule changes. I'm glad that they addressed some concerns that they had. I'm not sure with the leader flip and different things like that they made for some core rule changes. I'm glad they're doing it now. I'm not sure specifically what they're dealing with, whether it's something they're dealing with up and coming stuff that they're having problems with testing without clearly defining what that means, and leaves play and enters play and that sort of thing. It's good that they came out with it early. If it was a little bit earlier, I think it would have been better, because we would have been able to adjust to that going into the pre-release. I think it was only 1 week from when we were set to do the pre-release, so it didn't have a whole ton of impact on that, but I'm excited that they're willing to look at core rules and make some adjustments to it. I would be concerned if they had a whole bunch of core rules fundamental changes that happen every single set. That's not where I would want to be. Number 7, and this is less about the game and more about operations in general, and this is sort of, giving you a look under what we deal with as retailers. So we got shipped our product for set 2 about 3 weeks before I could sell it, which you would think, oh, this is fantastic. You've definitely got your product on hand. You don't have to worry about much. There's no problems with it, and there is a problem with it. There's a couple of problems with it, actually. Number 1, we saw all over the different buy-sell groups, cards were up immediately 3 weeks ago. People were selling cards like crazy all over the place. So a whole ton of retailers got their product and they handed them to people, and they went through and they sold a bunch of cards well above release date. All of the showcase cards were spoiled way ahead of time and different things like that. You didn't control anything. Of all the main line distributors that are out there, Alliance, ACD, GTS, PhD, Southern Hobbies is the only one that I've ever canceled an account for. So I don't know how Southern Hobbies handled their distribution, but this came directly from Asmodee, and we had it 3 weeks early. The problem with that is I get it 3 weeks early. It's a significant order. I'm not going to be able to sell my first pack until this week. Well, my bill's due next week. Normally I've got 30 days time between when they were shipped and when I could pay for the goods. So it gives me the opportunity to sell those goods, to recoup that money, to be able to pay for that stuff that's due. And now I've got 1 week. Now I can count the pre-release stuff that we sold and the packs that were there and the accessories and different things like that. That will go towards paying that bill. But instead of having the 30 days that I would normally have from the time that the product arrives, and sometimes we'll have we'll have 2 or 3 days grace before the actual release date. Well, in this case, I've got 8 and my bill's due, and it's tens of thousands of dollars. Now the money's in the bank, and that's not a problem. We're not dealing with a cash flow issue here per se. But it's one of those things where my money ends up coming due on this thing 3 weeks before it would normally become due. So I hope moving forward, there's some more attention paid to it for both of those things. Number 1, you've got people that are violating rules, and hopefully they find some of those people and they're punished for doing that kind of stuff, because those are the people that ruin things for everybody. Number 2, if this was February or January or December, I could understand you wanting to send it a little bit early, because maybe we'll get some snow. You folks are up in Roseville, Minnesota, and it snows up there. This is summertime. It's 92 degrees outside. I'm not worried about weather being a problem for this shipment. So for me, it's just trying to accelerate your accounting and accelerating your books and doing some cash grab stuff. And now it's a situation where normally this stuff would have been due 3 weeks earlier, and it would have been a lot easier to write that check than it is now, and it's not. Now it's the check's due at this time next week. So hopefully somebody over there takes a look at that and doesn't kind of saddle us with this sort of stuff. A lot of times when we see this stuff, and it's happened with Magic before in the past, is they're trying to make a quarter look better than what it is by either holding or fast forwarding stuff to make up for some sort of a financial windfall or loss. So they put that pressure on retail, and please don't do that. Like, give us the 30 days that we should normally get on that. All that said, I don't want this to feel like a big giant gloom and doom episode. I'm excited. I think the artwork was in line with what we saw for set 1. I don't think there were a lot of changes there. I think a lot of the stuff that we see in the set 2, unfortunately, when you're in design and development, and I've done this before, you're trying to build a meta and you're trying to build an environment that you feel comfortably that your people internally can work within. None of it matters when it gets out in the consumer's hand, though, because they just blow the doors off of everything. Because they start thinking about things that you didn't do. You know, whether it's Stalwart Battalion and the interaction with ECL, or all the other things that can come up that you didn't see in testing necessarily. This set was in the can before they could make any adjustments, before they saw the first game played by a consumer ever. So I don't begrudge them if some of the designs in here are light, or the sophomore slump is something that happens pretty consistently with collectible games in general, because a lot of times the launch set is really important. You have a whole ton of assets and a bunch of team on it. And then the second set, you have sort of less, or maybe there's not as much attention from the group because it's successful or it's not successful, and you make adjustments based on that and stuff. So we'll see. Time will tell whether set 2 was strong or not. Right now, sales for it have been good. Our pre-releases were insane. We had 25% increase from set 1. So there's a lot more people that are involved in the game and a lot more consistency there. I think we've got another one that we're running tonight. We're running one tonight, so that feels pretty good. The only other thing that I'll say is, boy, I really hope they work on that app. Like, let's get the app fixed. Let's get the app fixed. Let's get our tournament software fixed. We were supposed to have this done well before set 2. Like, let me print the pairings out and let me do the thing, and we're still not there. We're still taking screenshots and copy and paste things. So whoever's on the IT team over there needs to figure out something to get that squared away, because we certainly shouldn't be having that situation now. And it's just less data that you guys have in general as a team. With that, I'm going to close for this episode. Obviously, AMA immediately following the stream. I'll be honest with you, I have no idea what I'm going to talk about next week. Next week, I'm actually going to be out in Minnesota, so I'm probably going to film the episode on Tuesday, maybe, instead. I have a rant that I really want to go on that's just game industry stuff in general. So we'll see if I decide that I want to bring the heat on that, and then I'll be away from home for a couple of days over in Minnesota, so I can get out from underneath the fire. But either way, we'll have something for you next week as well. So happy gaming to everybody, and we'll close. Thanks.